Thank you for joining me this evening for This is the Work. What work? Well, if you know anything about my channel or about me personally, you know that I'm involved and I teach Christianity. It doesn't mean I don't do things that I don't regret or that I don't try to improve myself. In fact, it's odd even to have to say that. But because often at times I find people look at those who claim to be Christian as thinking they are better than others, is requiring a little bit of qualification, because when I talk about what we're going to do in terms of the work, I'm not talking about speaking in a way that gets to different aspects of Christian teaching or belief, like the end times, or in what form Jesus will come, bodily or spiritually. And I'm not talking about different potential applications of texts like those in Revelation or in books like Daniel. I'm talking about a more fundamental work. What work? Well, before I get into it specifically and define it from the text that I've lined up to explain the work, think of the work that you associate with Christianity right now. What is it? What do you, when you think of Christianity, think about? When I started the show, I kind of qualified me being a Christian, what I was going to talk about, by explaining, hey, this isn't maybe going to be what you typically hear or think about when you hear Christian or Christianity, right? Sometimes it can come across to people, maybe not you or me or those familiar with my channel, but to other people, when you just come right out and start talking about Christianity or being a Christian, what do they usually think about? Well, what do you usually think about? Most non-Christians who might be a little bit put off or not as comfortable with talking about Christianity or being a Christian, I find associate those terms and the concept of being a Christian with acting like you're better than them. It seems like that's how they take it. And I don't believe that's always correct. Because I know at times when I've been around people who I've seen felt that way, I didn't feel that way about them. I thought about why they felt that way. I could see it in their actions. And we all have our encounters with others where we can see and feel things and we kind of know. But we also know ourselves. So when we see their reaction to what they perceived in us, however, we're like, well, wait a minute, that's not me. But I can see its effect on you when I said that, or when you realize that about me, right? There's this effect that happens to people when some people, non-Christians. So what is it? What is it that they're thinking about? Well, like I said, I think in their case, they're thinking whatever it is we're doing, whether it's we're trying to be a better person, more honest, nicer, if we're at all openly associating that with Christianity, they kind of take it as us thinking we're better. It seems like that often to me. Not always, but at times when that happens, in ways that I don't intend it, it just seems to be felt by them that way. What about Christians? Okay, so we can see where, because of the different Christian groups or types of people who claim to be Christian, people might have an association based on their experience that is different from how we mean it or how we feel it or believe it. I had the same conversation on my property claims fraud review channel with someone who in the comments was expressing their opinion about an experience they had with an insurance company and how very negative it was, and how regardless of the things I had to say about fraud. Who cares, right? It's the insurance companies, in his view, I believe it was a he, it may have been a her. The name isn't very clear. It's not a he or she name, so I'll qualify it in that regard. Didn't matter because the insurance companies just run this big scam. And yet the person's description as insurance and claim adjusting or claims settlement as a big scam really is limited to that person's experience, is it not? And yet think of how many different people have experiences with insurance companies, with claims. Not all of them, and in fact most of them don't, think that it's a scam. Especially not the person whose house accidentally burns down and needs a big payout by an insurer, which is exactly what they get if they're covered. And they have the policy limits for the value of the house. All right, but that didn't stop the person from making a broad brush application of big scam to the entire insurance industry. And I called him out on that, him or her. We had a good conversation ultimately. My point is his association or her association with insurers, even in the context of a video highlighting fraud, was so effective in causing a reaction. It made the person express their own experience regardless of the fraud. Didn't matter. Until I took the time to sort of rearrange their thinking in light of what I've experienced, right? They can't speak for me. How could he or she? I'm me. And I've handled thousands of claims for and against insurers. So I would be in a much better position to know what happens more often than not or overall than an insured or a consumer who had one, maybe two claims in his or her life, even if they knew several other people who had claims, right? I've had thousands. So you can see where at times different people will respond to what you say or have to say or what you represent, even if it's right? What the person was telling me about their own experience in insurance companies, they weren't invalidating my video on fraud. They weren't really even commenting on it at all. They were just ignoring it completely. And so the person is so distracted by their own experience that they don't see anything differently. Unless, of course, they get one or more people like me that make them think differently. Or in the case of a religious experience, right? People might change people in a similar way, but we believe God could and does change a person's thinking. We can only do so much, right? So what is the work that is only so much? What do you think about when now as a Christian you hear, right? Well, there could be different contexts, so rather than create one that might make you guess, just think about it again. So Christian, because of the different groups, for me, it's difficult to get an immediate association apart from the original texts with modern day examples in ways that I accept, right? Because when we think about Christianity today, it isn't just one thing. It is and it isn't, right? I mean, we believe it is. But let's be honest here for a moment. Not everyone believes the same thing about what we believe it is, the texts. So it can't be that we have the same work in every respect, right? Because we believe different. The work that we have as Christians is not all the same, for example, when it comes to what the Watchtower does, right? Not every Christian group does the same work, right? There is a crossover, of course, with regard to texts, right? Watchtower, Jehovah's Witnesses use the Bible, and other Christian groups use the Bible. And so you could also to it in a different way, I'll, of course, include people like Mormons. They use the Bible. So there's going to be some overlap with pretty much every other Christian group that actually accepts the Bible, or the New Testament, right, at least. Okay, but that aside, right, we get mostly significant differences highlighted among the groups, and that's how they're defined. So we don't go around usually and define every group based on their use of the Bible. We define them based on the other things that they believe that one group or the other doesn't agree with or accept as from the Bible. Okay, so this work, this is the work. And you saw the image in the thumbnail of what? A man with his hand around a snake's mouth and then grabbing it with the other and then carrying it out. What is that? What are we talking about? Was that just like talking about fighting the devil? Kind of. But it's not that simple. All right. So hopefully at least you have some visualization in your mind about Christian and Christianity. I wanted that to sink in a little bit because we're going to define now using these texts the work that you should think about right away. The number one thing, other than, of course, Jesus, obviously, or Jah. I'm not going that basic, remember? We're kind of going past even the golden rule that I was talking about. That even though it's a part of everything we do, it's not... Right? Every Christian group would agree with the golden rule and principle and probably try to apply it and do, more or less. But we've also shown that we can't be doing the same work because we don't accept each other as the same in every respect. And so the work that we do is different based on our differences, even if there's overlap and similarity with regard to the text. Okay, so in one sense then, we know that we can't be doing the same work because we don't work together. We're not promoting the same things. In fact, when we're together, what do? We argue about things. We do. Almost always. Unless we're here for the purpose to be together as a group, and not argue as our group. Doesn't mean we're better than others in terms of how we view it. It's just we believe these things are more important. 3 things. Everything else, leave it aside. Let's talk about these. Let's go. Let's focus. Promote these things. We know about this other stuff. Is that more important? No. Back to the 3. Okay. So we're that kind of group. We're not really a beginners group, although we have people who are new, and so they become beginners in that sense, associated with us. But really, you become like us when you're ready to believe and teach very specific things. The truth about God, the truth about Jesus, Messiah, and the golden rule. So in one sense, there's some application or overlap like I was talking about with tax, the golden rule. But then, after that, we're different. So what's the work? Is only one group doing the work because we're different and we're not working together? Or is it the same work, regardless of our differences, and whether or not we're together? Let's take a look at some of these texts, right? 1 John chapter 3. Join me. We'll go ahead and use the NWT because, as you know, I'm familiar with it. I find it acceptable or more than acceptable in most cases, and I'm happy to defend it or discuss it further if we have a significant issue. Otherwise, you can join me using your copy of this text, or you can listen or read with me here. So 1 John chapter 3, take a look at verse 8. He who carries on sin, right? Sin, it's one of those words. You know how I was talking about Christianity. This show's really for Christians, specifically Christian Witnesses of Jah, but really any Christian, and for others who are just interested. But there are certain words, okay? There's certain words that when Christians hear them, we hear it certain ways. That when non-Christians hear them, they hear it the same way, kind of, but it's not with the same appreciation or thought or recognition. There's different effects. And one of those is sin, right? It's one of those words. It really just means you missed the mark, right? Didn't do something right, but you wanted to do it anyway. And you keep doing it, even though it's wrong. A lot of examples like that. All right. He who carries on sin originates with the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. Now notice this part. For this purpose the Son of God was made manifest, namely, to break up the works of the devil. The works of the devil. What are those? All right, now we have two questions, right? We have our work. This is the work. And then we have the works of the devil. Well, let's take a little further look in other writings associated with John, namely Revelation, chapter 6, verse 9. All right, so the Son of God was manifest to break up the works of the devil. What does that remind you of? Textually, Old Testament. Genesis 3, right? He's going to crush the serpent in the head. Break up the works of the devil. Revelation 6:9. What are the works of the devil? Because that's going to help define our work. You'll see. We could define it directly, but there's a reason I'm doing it this way. Because our work is inseparably linked to the devil's work. We can't escape each other. So we have to deal with each other as we're doing different works. Revelation 6:9. And when he opened the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those slaughtered because of the word of God and because of the witness work that they used to have. The witness work. So these slaughtered or executed Christians, that's what the context shows, were killed because of their witness work. Witness about what? What is the witness? What does that mean? Let's go further for a moment. Revelation 12:17. Follow with me here. We're building up to something I think you'll find interesting because we have all these different groups, right? We've got Catholics, Protestants, different groups that are considered Protestant to some, but not to others. They're more cultish. Everyone thinks they're the one, right? Or at least part of the one body or group that's doing the work. So what work? Is it this sort of shared, overlapping, universal promotion of biblical texts, regardless of the division that we demonstrate next. And so we'll talk more about that in a moment, why that's not likely the case, because we often, I think, provide a disgrace when we over-debate. Debating at times is right and even required because we have to make a stand, right? But we don't have to fight. The slave of the Lord does not need to fight. Paul made that explicitly clear. And when we fight with each other, even if people, remember at the beginning when I said, what do you think people think when they hear Christianity? And I was talking about non-Christians, right? What do you think they think when they hear? And what you thought about? We kind of, or at least I vocalized how I thought they think about how we think we're better than them. And so when we argue with each other, what does that show to them, non-Christians? Do you think? What would that show? What to think about in your mind? Two proclaimed Christians, right? People who claim to be Christian, but not, let's say, non-Trinitarian and Trinitarian. When people see that, right? I'm not talking about maybe once, right? Okay, I've debated White, I've debated Bowman, others, but let's just say they see this regular debate, whether it's the same person or multiple people. Let's just say when non-Christians see us debate, what do you think they think about? They can't even agree. That one thinks they're right, that one thinks they're right, that one thinks they're better. They both think they're better than me, and they can't even agree. I think they think like that because it seems like that. Sometimes it doesn't, right? There's times we can do things right, but all the time. What I'm getting at is what are we supposed to be doing to define the work that we're supposed to be doing that comes from these texts? What if we're really doing something that is the exact opposite of what we're supposed to be? I'm not saying that's the case, but wouldn't that be something? We'd want to know that, wouldn't we? I would. I'm not saying I've ever really done that. I wouldn't even say when I was with the Watchtower I was doing the opposite, right? And I say with the Watchtower because obviously I don't believe everything I did when I was there. But I believed it in the way that I presented according to the text that I could share. And I didn't try to force anyone to accept things like prophecies or chronologies. I pretty much just tried to teach what I teach now, but in association with those other things, right? So, everyone grows through certain points and to certain points. We have to become better or we get worse. And so at different times we may be better or worse. But what I'm trying to focus on is the work. We can get better or worse. We can learn more. But what is fundamentally the things we're already supposed to know and share, no matter what else happens? And I mean no matter what, no matter where, no matter what. We're going to talk about text and Acts. And I'm going to show you no matter where, no matter what. So, this work, I think, has kind of gotten lost. And I, at times, get lost from the work. But I've done my best to focus on it. And I think you'll see in what we discussed that in just forming CWJ and trying to keep it focused on the three things, that's kind of what I mean. It hasn't been easy, and I get distracted. When I see people thinking about things that I don't think are really as important as the three, but right, I'm not every person, so people have to answer that for themselves, but I get distracted then, right? Because they're talking about it now. And so, I want to create an awareness, strangely, of what we already know, right? We know what we're supposed to do. And if we've forgotten, let's take a look at a few more texts. Revelation 12 17 next. The dragon grew wrathful at the woman and went off to wage war with the remaining ones of her seed. Okay, that's a big deal, right? We talked about this text recently. And we're going to highlight it here with regard to what I spoke of a moment ago, and that is our work, this work, and the works of the devil. Son of God was made manifest, according to 1 John, to break up the works of the devil. All right, well, we know that he did that through his life and sacrifice, conquering death, being raised to the right hand of the Father. But the devil's works are not done. Right? He did not defeat the Son. But what are the texts that tell us about revelations from the Son, a revelation from the Son would happen? What the works that the devil would pursue would be defined by war. He fails in dealing with the Son of God and goes off to wage war with us. Who are us? Those who observe the commandments of God and have the work of bearing witness to Jesus. And that is really what God commands, right? That is the command of God, that you believe the one whom he has sent, according to John, according to Jesus. So, bearing witness to Jesus, commandments of God. Let's take a look at another text, Revelation 19:10. Works of the devil, our work of bearing witness to Jesus. He's at war with us. Are we at war with him? If so, how so? Same way? Revelation 19:10. At that I fell down before his feet to worship him. But he tells me, be careful, do not do that. All I am is a fellow slave of you and of your brothers who have the work of witnessing to Jesus. Worship God. For the bearing witness to Jesus is what inspires prophesying. Now, as those of you who followed my shows and who've read these texts before know, throughout Revelation, the angel who is sent by Jesus speaks for Jesus and for Jah, and he does so right here. And he goes on to speak to this angel. The angel corrects him because he ends up worshiping the angel as an angel and not as God, whom the angel is representing, right? But the angel makes it clear, in addition to directing the worship to God, that the work the angel and John's brothers have is bearing witness to Jesus. So what is that? Let's take a look at the book of Acts. Let's go ahead and turn to Acts. Excuse me. We'll start with Acts chapter 12. Actually, we'll move on to another one. I think it'll be a little bit more applicable to what we're discussing. I have several sections from Acts, like I talked about in the pre-show, that I can highlight that pertain to this work. Let's start with Acts chapter 13. So, this is an account involving Paul and Barnabas. And in verse 43 it says, "So after the synagogue assembly was dissolved, many of the Jews and of the proselytes worshiped God. Followed Paul and Barnabas, who in speaking to them began urging them to continue in the undeserved kindness of God." And then it says in verse 46, "So talking with boldness, Paul and Barnabas said it was necessary for the word of God first to be spoken to you. Since you are thrusting it away from you and you do not judge yourselves worthy of everlasting life, look, we turn to the nations." And then look what he does in verse 47. "In fact, Yahuwah or Jehovah has laid commandment upon us in these words. I have appointed you as a light of nations, for you to be a salvation to the extremity of the earth." And then verse 48, "When those of the nations heard this, they began to rejoice and to glorify the word of Jehovah, and all those who were rightly disposed for everlasting life became believers." And I understand, non-Watchtower people, that this is probably not an account in which the divine name should be used, because it's not a quotation from the Old Testament texts. Now, it is referring to a quotation from the Old Testament where Jehovah speaks, and that's why the NWT at times uses the divine name apart from an actual quotation like here. But this isn't about the divine name. So, I'm just going to point that out, though, because I know it can be distracting for some. And I want us to focus on the work that is to come. Again, we can get distracted on anything. We can argue with anyone. We start arguing with ourselves. How are we going to convince anyone? We argue with ourselves. Are we convinced? One of us can't be convinced because one of us, and maybe both of us, if two of us are arguing, are not able to let it rest. Now, when you're convinced of something, you don't need to keep proving it. You want to know how I know why? Because I can think of all kinds of illustrations. Let me just share one. Let's say you own a house and you share a property line that has a rock that's owned by your neighbor, but that's crossing over into your property line. Very clearly, about a good solid foot, 12 inches. You go through the process of establishing where your property line is. You prove legally by going down to the building department, pulling the records, showing where it's marked, that the rock is on your property. And you have every right legally to have it moved, right? Maybe it's interfering, it could cause an accident, people could get injured, you could get blamed for it. You go through the steps, you prove it. Your neighbor's rock is on your property. No question about it. Your neighbor moves the rock because they have to, but then still continues to claim they didn't have to move the rock. They just did it, but they were actually correct. They're right. And you were wrong. But you proved, right, and even got them to move the rock. They still think you're wrong. Now, how long are you going to spend arguing about that rock that you've already proven should be moved because it was on your property, causing a hazard, and actually was moved, so it was enforced, it was done? How long are you going to spend arguing with the person over whether or not they were right or you were right about moving that rock? You won. You established that the rock had to be moved off of your property and was moved. It's the same thing. They have us arguing about the rocks we've already had moved. And if we keep arguing about something we've already proved, Yahuwah may have to use the rocks, right? Because we won't move. We won't move from arguing about something we've already proved. And while we're doing that, guess who's moving around that rock? You know who? I was going to show you. I am going to show you. Well. The snake. The snake is moving around the rock that you don't have to argue about, that you've already had moved. But if we allow ourselves to get distracted from what we're supposed to do, now that we've already proved and had done what we needed to do, sometimes we've got to move a rock. Sometimes we've got to argue with people about moving that rock. Once the rock has been moved, we don't need to argue about the rock. You can go and stand on your lawn right next to that rock that your neighbor has on their lawn and argue about who was right and who was wrong all day long. Why would you do that? I'll tell you why. Because you want your neighbor to admit that they should have moved that rock. Right? They shouldn't have put you through the trouble of having to go through proving what was obvious or could have been accepted earlier. Right? There is a reason why you might feel, why the neighbor's attempt to argue with you might cause an effect and bring you over to argue about something that's not a part of our work. But we might think it is, right? Because we start talking about what? We start talking about God in this case, right? I'm using the metaphor in terms of if we talk about with a Trinitarian, the identity of God metaphysically, if that's the rock. Once we have proven and established with whomever our views, we don't have to keep doing it. There's no text that says that. We're going to talk about more in a moment. Like the text we're reviewing here together in Acts 13. Right? Paul and Barnabas don't keep arguing with the Jews here when it's very clear that they were jealous and contradicting the things spoken by Paul. In verse 45 it says, when the Jews got sight of the crowds who were following Barnabas and Paul, they were filled with jealousy and began blasphemously contradicting the things being spoken by Paul. And then, as we read, with boldness, Paul and Barnabas said, it's necessary for the word of God first to be spoken to you, right? Well, we'll deal with you. We're going to show you it's okay and that you, in fact, have to move that rock. You can still deny it. You can still argue with us. We had to first deal with you. But now that you're not listening, even after we've proven and moved the rock, we're not going to keep dealing with you. We're going to turn our attention to these people. And look at what they do. They quote the text. They don't just say it, right? They don't just assume they have this right to stop talking to these people. They cite the text that gives them the basis to move away from them. Why? Because they're not listening. They're contradicting. They're not there to help. They're not there to reinforce the texts to those who are, because of Barnabas and Paul, worshiping God. So Paul says, we're thrusting that away from you. Then look at what happened. The people that heard it, they loved it. They reacted. Right now, if Paul and Barnabas would have seen their work here as necessarily requiring them to keep arguing with these opposers, do you think verse 48 would have happened? I doubt it, right? Because then they wouldn't have had an occasion to apply this text, which applies to these people who were so happy about it. Right? So, I think, excuse me, there's our little image of the snake again. I might come back to that. I think this account shows us an excellent example of how we first will, of course. We don't back away from people. Anyone. Did Jesus? No. But did he keep on? No. He dealt with the devil, right? Directly. Several times. And then said what? Get away from me. Go away. You didn't just say, okay, what's your next question? Next question. I got all day. No. No, that's not what he did at all. He did what he had to do and he moved on. Like Paul. And as a result, the people who weren't listening anyway just got more upset and went away, while the people whom Paul and Barnabas got to keep talking to rejoiced over it, became believers as a result. And so in verse 2 of chapter 14, it goes on and says, but the Jews that did not believe stirred up and wrongly influenced the souls of people of the nations against the brothers. All right. We talked about the works of the devil when we kind of started the show and then moved into the initial texts, right? 1 John chapter 3. Then we talked about Revelation and how when the dragon is thrown out of heaven, it goes to war with those who have the work of bearing witness. Do you think these kinds of works right here in Acts 14:2 qualify? Right? We don't know if directly the devil was involved here, but certainly if the dragon is waging war, and I'm not saying that this is the war time, I'm saying this kind of opposition would be the kind you would categorize as engagement, right? War, a battle. Right? They're not just allowing each side to have their moment and then let people decide. No, it says the ones who didn't believe stirred up and wrongly influenced the souls of people of the nations against them. Verse 3, therefore they spent considerable time speaking with boldness by the authority of CWJah, and who bore witness to the word of his undeserved kindness by granting signs and portents to occur through a hand. However, the multitude of the city was split, and some were for the Jews, but others for the apostles. So they spent a lot of time with authority, says of Jehovah, of the Lord, either one, right? Because Christ's authority comes from Yahweh. All authority in heaven and on earth sits on the Father's throne. We've talked about it. So I'm not going to get caught up other than noting it just so people are aware and know that I'm aware that I don't agree with every use of the divine name in these texts where it's not quoted from the Old Testament. So we'll move past that. And you can see here that they didn't just pass through, right? They spent a lot of time here and then earlier. But because the Jews who didn't believe got involved, started influencing them, right? Kind of undid the work that the apostles had done. then they had to spend more time and deal with others. And so at this point, the city is basically split. Now, I would say we can agree as Christians, using the text, they're doing work, right? This is work, right? This is work. And whether you see it, representatively as that, if you recognize, as I just described, the opposition here as fitting the kind of war engagement and resistance that the devil or the dragon is spoken of as doing later, and did during the time Jesus was alive and after, but differently since Revelation 12 forward, it seems. We'll get back to it. But certainly here, we have what could be associated with that activity of the dragon, right? The war. Went off to wage war with the remaining ones of her seed. It could even be applying here, right? Because the seed of the woman has been caught away to the throne at this point, if you look at Revelation that way. And after the dragon failed, if you understood the time when it came down to the earth as being right after Jesus' enthronement in heaven, and that having occurred in the first century, then it's possible you could see that kind of direct resistance and war happening right here. But that's what I'm looking at. Right? That's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing the Christians after Jesus working, like we read about in Revelation, bearing witness. Right? This is it. This is how they did it. We know how Jesus did it, and we've talked about it, and we will again, but that's right. He's the one they're bearing witness to. We have the work of bearing witness to him. So while his example is certainly number one, we really are falling into the category of those who came after him, and then we're bearing witness about the things he did, like Paul and Barnabas. All right, and so you can see here that once they were split, it says a violent attempt took place on the part of both people of the nations and the Jews with their rulers to treat them insolently and pelt them with stones. They, on being informed of it, fled, went on declaring the good news. So you can certainly see in this activity the Christians working, can you not? Let's just take a quick review of it again. We start around verse 35 where it says that the Jews got jealous, began contradicting Paul. He and Barnabas spoke boldly, talked about the text applying to the Jews and to the nations. And then that made the people of the nations present rejoice, got the Jews who were against them all upset. And then it says the word of the Lord went on being carried out throughout the whole country. The Jews kept resisting them. But they didn't leave. They kept entering other synagogues. Verse 1 of chapter 14. The whole city got divided against them. They still spent time speaking with boldness, bearing witness, even with signs and great authority, it says. But they were nonetheless driven out with stones and treated with insolence. So, in one sense, the work we do as Christians, right, it has that sense, whether you're a Christian or not, of teaching others like you see Paul and Barnabas doing. But what non-Christians, and sometimes even Christians, don't think about when we think of the work we do is the resistance, the difficulty we have. What's against us? I think we at times think more so about people who already claim to be Christian, and we seek to engage them in ways to correct them to be more in line with our thinking, versus spending our time focusing on those who haven't begun believing and leaving others who claim to be Christian to be judged by their own master. Right? How are we going to correct somebody else when we already believe differently than most Christians? Are we going to fix everything, do we think? That's what leads really to the exclusivity that many groups accept for themselves, right? Because there's really no other way to see it without compromising on some level the differences that mark you as separate. If you don't emphasize those differences to the extent that you remain separate, then why have the differences? That's us, right there. And the difference is that we don't have those differences, and so we still stand out because, well, we do have three things, right? And we have those three things a little different than others, and so there would still be separation. But my point is, our basis of separation, CWJ, is three things. Right? That's a lot easier to keep in check and not get distracted from the work while promoting them than having a whole bunch of other things to have to bring with you on this work that we go and see. How many things did they focus on when they were talking to the Jews and to the Gentiles here? Well, let's go take a look. It talks about how they were speaking about the undeserved kindness of God. And right before that is when they were bearing witness to the authority of Jesus since his resurrection, whom God raised up. So, we have pretty much a repeated pattern throughout these texts that I'm going to show further now, but I wanted to highlight there here so that you could see really what the context is about, and that is the presentation of the great message about the Christ. I mean, that's what they're promoting. They kind of all agree on, there's no real dispute on God, because they all agree who God is. Right? Even Jesus says, right, I've come in the name of my Father, the one whom you say is your God. There was no disagreement about the God. The disagreement was about Jesus. They had some other disagreements, but the primary dispute related to Jesus. What does the dragon primarily dispute? The seed of Jesus. What does the Son of God break up? The works of the devil. What are the works of the devil? His war against us. All of it. Everything he can bring, that he's allowed to bring. He can't just bring anything. The texts show that. Job, right? He has to get permission. Even Jesus said that Satan requested to have his disciples sifted as wheat, right? He can't just go and do it. Not everything. Neither can or do Yahweh or Jesus, execute or immediately destroy every work of the devil, right? They're allowed to continue. Let's take a look. First, let's show one other account here real briefly. There's so many, but I want to highlight at least one or two in Acts where you can see the way they worked and what it was about. It was about Jesus. God too, but he wasn't disputed. He's disputed now because groups like Trinitarians and non-Trinitarians, and then other groups, of course, non-Christian groups, view God differently. Although groups like CWJ and groups like Jews who believe in the Old Testament would probably see God very similarly, if not the same. And the sons of God similarly are the same. So, it's different than it was during the time in the first century where the dispute revolved mostly around Jesus unless it pertained to God in cases like where there was a dedication to an unknown God, and then God became the subject of the discussion there. And so that is a part of it, right? We bear witness to God and to Jesus according to the texts. We worship God and bear witness to Jesus, the one whom he sent. So I wanted to share, though, how in these texts they continue to quote texts and to publish information based on the texts that they knew people knew or that they could use to complete their work. The texts were what they were using. Even with Romans and others, people didn't really believe like the Jews because they had respect for the ancestry of the Jews and the religion and the things that they taught and believed. And so when people came along like the Christians and associated these things with the Messiah according to Jewish law, they got some respect for at different times and before others. And so it says here that in Acts 17:1, this is the other account I'm going to share with you about how they did their work and what it was like. There are many of them, but we're going to talk about some other texts in a moment. I wanted to share a couple here, though, so we could kind of get a sense of what actually happens in these accounts in Acts. Here it says, they journeyed through Amphipolis and Apollonia and came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Verse 2, so according to Paul's custom, he went inside to them, and for 3 Sabbaths he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. Verse 3, explaining and proving by references that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, saying, this is the Christ, this Jesus, whom I'm publishing to you. And then verse 4, as a result, some of them became believers, associated themselves with Paul and Silas, and a great multitude of Greeks who worship God, and not a few of the principal women did so. It goes on to describe a lot more, which happens. It's very interesting as well, but I just wanted to focus on this part here to show again how they focused on proving the truth about the Christ. That was their work. That was what they needed to show, because that he's the fulfillment of everything that they knew to that point about the Jews and the Jewish law and what it meant. And that has everything to do with every human and how we've come to have any laws in this world. And so, at least in our view, right? Because it all started back in Genesis, the Garden of Eden, where people now know what to do. According to Isaiah chapter 7, it says at a certain age we know right and wrong, just like in Genesis, when they took for themselves the knowledge of right and wrong. So they now no longer learned from Jah, but knew it on their own when they weren't ready. And so that's something that happens to everybody. And in that sense, by being redeemed through Jesus, we believe it affects everybody. God so loved the world, right? John 3:16. That's what that means. So we've all been enslaved through sin to death because we've made choices that are deserving of law. And unless we receive forgiveness through Jesus, the consequence is death. And even so, through faith in Jesus, we can have life even if we die. This is our belief as Christians. It's what we teach about Jesus Christ, right? First, we have to teach people about the Christ. Well, first we have to teach them about God, like we do. We can show God exists scientifically. Life can only come from life. There's no evidence to the contrary, and all evidence showing that's true. And life is obviously intelligent based on everything we see and do and find and realize about the way life is made, the way we make things, the different things that are made. All show marks of intelligence and utility, adaptability, suitableness, usableness, intention. And we can show historically, as I have done in CWJah Talk 30 and 31, that eternal intelligent life historically can be identified as the God Jah, or Jah. We can defend all of those forms of his name because that's the name that comes to us in those forms that we speak in anglicized forms in English today, like I just did, but that you can speak in your own language and still represent faithful pronunciation to one or all of those original forms. And so, in this case, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how everything comes back to that ultimately. So let's go further then and take a look at James. All right, so we can see clearly that this is what they were showing. They didn't have to really focus on God. We do today because we get into discussions and disagreements with people that we don't see them doing then, right? They didn't have this issue. They didn't have Trinitarianism then. It wasn't a problem because no one was teaching the Trinity. The Jews didn't have it as something to deal with regard to the early Christians. They just had to deal with whether or not he was who was prophesied to be the Christ, the Son of God. And that was enough. It still is with Jews today, of course, but we have other people, like I said, other Christians that claim to be doing the same work, but teaching something different. All right, let's take a look at two more accounts, and then we'll kind of move towards wrapping this up. But we need to clearly define this work. And so far, I've tried to make associations that make this fairly clearly related to bearing witness to Jesus and teaching the truth about God, which is what we do, which is what they did. So, it talks about the things God did with the Christ, how he raised him up from the dead. So God is all over everything they're promoting about Jesus. He's not apart from it. It's just not highlighted the way it is today with the Trinity. So, when we do that, we're just making it more difficult on ourselves. We're arguing with that neighbor whom we've already proven had to move the rock and did move the rock, and now they just want to waste our time arguing about who was right about what's already been done and shown to be correct, but that they don't accept, even though it's been established as correct. Right? We've done the work. We've shown it. We stood up and defended it. We don't have to keep doing it over and over again, and if we do that, is it worth it? What are we gaining? We're really losing, aren't we? We're losing our opportunities to avoid the snake that's around the rock and to find people who aren't going to argue with us. Like those Gentiles in Acts chapter 13 and 14. Right? They were there, they wanted to believe, and then it was the ones who were blasphemously and insolently contradicting the apostles who made it hard. And then they had to deal with them, and then they left them, right? They didn't keep arguing with them. They went to them first, and they said, fine, you're not going to listen, you're going to keep arguing, you don't want to learn. You already know the text, right? We don't need to teach you. Why do you need us? You're the Jew. You have them. You don't agree with us. Fine. This text says we're going to go to the nations, and that's exactly what we're going to do. That's the work. The work is not getting held up arguing with these people, whether they're Jews, whether they're non-Jews, whether they're Trinitarian Christians and want to argue with us. Other Christians, when they claim to be Christian, just like us, in claiming to be Christian, but with differences, their claim is not to us. Their claim is to the Master. Now, true, we don't want people out there teaching false beliefs about God or the Christ. But who's better to hold them accountable? Maybe we have to do it openly first because we see it and we know it's not right. And so we say, hey, wait a minute. You sure you got that right? We point out the correct teaching. Oh, fine. You don't want to listen to us? Okay. Well, this text says, I don't have to keep talking to you. You already know the text anyway. It's just like the Jews in Acts 13 and 14. Why do we have to keep arguing with people who already know these texts? We don't. We just do it because we want them to admit, like the person who had to move the rock, our neighbor in that illustration, that we were right. We want them to admit that. We want them to admit we were correct. And so we will go spend time and we will stand at the dividing line of our yard with the neighbor who we already proved we were right and who had to move the rock. But we'll argue with them all day long about something we already know. because we want them to admit it. Does that sound right? It is right, but it's not right, right? It's right in terms of what happens, but it's not right. Does that sound like a good use of your time, of our time, and under any condition? We've already proven what's right. We've already had it be established, but they just don't agree. And they want to take our time and argue with us when we could be enjoying our yard that's rock-free. Right? We don't have the hazard anymore. So why are we arguing about it? Because that thing again, we want a certain level of satisfaction personally, and I'm here to tell you that rarely happens. It rarely happens. You tell me, how many times have you had someone actually admit to you, you know you're right? I was wrong. I didn't see it that way, but now that you mention it, I should have moved that rock. Sometimes it happens. Not a lot. So, if it doesn't happen a lot, why do we do it a lot? Is that our work? Not according to the text we read there in Acts 13 and 14. And even here, right? It says he explained and proved by references. That's the work. But look what happened. Just like in Acts 13 and 14. The Jews, getting jealous, took into their company certain wicked men of the marketplace, formed a mob, and got the city into an uproar. They assaulted the house. They dragged people to the city rulers, made false complaints about them, claimed they were in opposition to Caesar. Right? And all they were doing was this. That's the work. Right there. Right? Of course, like I said, in association with God and the golden rule, which is what Jesus said fulfilled the entire law and how we treat each other. But my point is, the God part comes up more today with Trinitarians and others, not so much here in the first century, so the bearing witness to Christ is highlighted, and for good reason, right? They needed to know that. That was the issue. That was what all these texts and the human condition was leading to. And then it happened. And then they started quoting all these texts and telling all these people what happened. Hey, all these texts were talking about these events that just happened. And everybody's aware of it. All these people are talking. All this evidence is here. The Jews had him put to death, and these texts showed this is what was going to happen. Now we can see it's clear. So, nevertheless, the idea that, so what is that really, right? You're basically just saying you think that events that happened were foretold and correctly came about. And those events amount to what as a Christian? Remember what we were talking about, what you think of? We talked about what other people who are not Christian think of. Sometimes that we're better than them. And sometimes we give into that whole idea when we argue with each other. But when we don't do that, we don't give off that impression. And like in Acts 13, we can convince a whole lot of people, right? Not the ones who are arguing with us, but the ones we have time to talk to because we're not arguing with them. That's the work. And it doesn't change the effect. Even when we stop directly arguing with people, like Paul and Barnabas did, they still come after us. Because either they just decide to do it on their own because they hate the work of Christians, right? Which is what amounts to what? Belief in a man who gave his life in service to God, didn't hurt anybody, and whom we believe releases us from death by acting in the way he taught us, to treat each other fairly, the way we want to be treated. That's it. That's all this amounts to. Belief in this. a man who was faithful to God, taught us how to live, that's without hypocrisy, and whom we believe was so unique in the way things happened with him, that if we live the same way, that is fairly with everybody, that we can have life after death. That's it. We give God respect, thank him for this provision, and believe in it, and teach others about it. That's it. That's what's got all these people so upset. Does that sound like something that would upset a lot of people to you? Teaching someone about a man who died faithful to God without hurting anybody, taught us how to live fairly with each other, and that in our view, because of his uniqueness, we believe in him, we might have life after death. Does that hurt anybody? Where's the damage in that? Well, that's what they were doing right here. And look at what it did. They got jealous, took into their company wicked people, formed a mob, and had them dragged before the rulers. Right? So, to me, that sounds like somebody who has a lot of anger, a lot of enmity, a lot of hatred. That's not normal. That's not normal treatment. That sounds like someone who's at war. But we don't always see it, right? We don't even, we can associate with the dragon and the war that we've talked about, and as Christians we know about. But when you see people getting jealous and resisting your witness, which is what, right? Right here. Proving by references things about the Christ. Well, we already know you have a lot of information in the Bible overall. And there are other things, of course, you can use. And I have videos about non-Christian evidence for Jesus as a real person. And 10 separate videos specifically promoting the pre-Christian evidence that shows things were uniquely fulfilled in him, that were foretold hundreds of years before he actually lived. So this is not just nothing. This is a big deal, and it was a big deal to these people. And their work was telling people about it. That was it. Living, of course, the way they were taught, but we already know what that is. Golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. Otherwise, their whole work was promoting belief in God and evidence that Jesus was the Christ. That's it. Among themselves, Christians had different discussions about things like what they should promote in terms of teachings about blood and things like Acts 5 and elsewhere. But the core presentation to people who were new or to the Jews who didn't believe was Jesus. Was belief in him as the Messiah. And then, of course, to people like Greeks who believed in an unknown God, when God became relevant, the biblical God. Now, I've kind of made parallels here with people like the Jews who were resisting the early Christians and some of the debates we get into today with other Christians who believe differently, right? But who really are declaring their faith in the Master. And so when we engage them and argue with them, more than just, a day or a few days, right? Depending on your circumstance. It was easier for them to spend time in terms of days with each other back then because they were visiting longer. Whereas we might be able to accomplish that more in just a few hours with what they were able to accomplish in a few days. But either way, we don't spend months, years, and just like our whole life based around engaging those who don't believe we are doing the right things. And it's even more difficult today, I believe, because unlike with the Jews and the Christians, while they had shared acceptance of the biblical text in the Old Testament, with Christians today, we can't even come to a resolution on the metaphysics of God or the metaphysics of Christ or the physical nature of Christ, at least today. And then so many other traditions or beliefs that aren't as important as those beliefs have become important enough to separate from others. When it comes to Christian witnesses of Jah, our work is this work. That's it. No traditions. We may have them. Right? We may have things we've just grown used to doing on our own and with other people. That's fine. That's not what we teach. We don't promote that as the thing people need to focus on, right? What did they focus on? That's our work. What did the text in Revelation and John say to focus on? Bearing witness to Jesus, worship God. Now take a look at with me James chapter 3. We're going to get James 3 and Matthew 13, and we're going to wrap it up. James 3. This is the work. Bearing witness to Jesus as the Christ. If you're already talking to someone who believes Jesus is the Christ, you're not doing the work. Right? Unless you're sharing together with that person in a way that is allowing you the ability to, develop a kind of spiritual togetherness and worship together, then you're not going to be doing the work you're supposed to do if you're arguing with other Christians. In fact, you might be helping undo the very work we're supposed to be doing. It can happen, but the extent to which we can limit that from happening, right? We should. It's not easy though, right? Remember the neighbor. The neighbor with the rock, right? He thinks you're wrong. You already proved he had to move the rock. It was on your property, creating a hazard. Had to be moved. Still wants to argue with you about it. I didn't have to move my rock. I just did it so I didn't have to have an ongoing issue with the city. But I'm right and you're wrong. And you shouldn't have had me move your rock. You should feel bad. I see the whole establishing of the position in contradiction to the facts and the reality of the situation, right? It can have well, wait a minute now. You're not, even though you've complied, even though you've agreed, I want you to openly tell me you agree with me. That's almost never going to happen, right? Maybe more so in the neighbor's case with the rock and that, but I'm using an illustration. How many times do people, after you spend even hours with them, days, how many times, I'm not talking about new people, I'm talking about, say, a Trinitarian and non-Trinitarian. How many times can you remember, after spending, we'll say 10 hours with someone, multiple texts, whole accounts, how many times can you remember after doing that, one or the other or both of you agreeing and coming together? It just doesn't happen that often, does it? You would think it would. It's kind of a little tricky because you would think, all right, well, we have texts. This person wants to talk about them. I want to talk. I can show. Okay. No. Doesn't happen. Because they're doing different work. And they've been taught that the work that they're doing is the work that's important. And it may be impossible for you to change them from that mindset. Because they already know the texts. They're already praying all these things. If God wants to change them, He would. He can. Maybe He's using you to plant or water here, but not every time and ongoingly. It's overwatering again. We talked about that as well, right? So James chapter 3. What does this have to tell us here? I think we're getting into some good stuff, and I wanted to have a show that just kind of laid off the whole technical stuff, like with the Trinity, and we'll get into that more later, of course, but we really need to talk more about, I think, what we're supposed to be doing. I get these questions, and I understand. And I have questions too that, maybe aren't directly related to the work we're talking about, but I try to limit it because I know and I've learned to focus on this. But I get questions about so many things, and I think, well, I wonder, are people really focused on the work? I know things come up, but anything could come up. Is it as important as this work? James chapter 3, and we'll read a few verses. James 3:13 through 4:12. Listen to this. My brothers and sisters, all right? But he's writing specifically to the brothers in this case, but I'll expand it only because we have sisters probably with us. We have Betsy and others. So, and I think most of what applies here is not specific to Christian men in terms of their gender. He's just directly addressing them. My brothers, a fig tree cannot produce olives or vines figs, can it? Neither can salt water produce sweet water. All right. Verse 13. Actually, I wanted to start in verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? That's a pretty big question, wouldn't you say? Who is wise and understanding among you? Who would you say in your community and circle? If someone came to you and says, I'm new here. Who around here is wise and understanding in your Christian group? Verse 13, let him show out his fine conduct, his works with a mildness that belongs to wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy, contentiousness in your hearts, do not be bragging and lying against the truth. How can you brag? If you have bitterness, bitter jealousy, and contentiousness in your hearts, what would bring that about? Do you think arguing with other people would bring that about? Almost always, right? Unless you're doing it in a more professional way, in a nicer way. But if it's kind of the back and forth like we read about in Acts 13 and elsewhere, where they were blasphemously contradicting Paul and Barnabas and then stirring up a whole mob against them, right? I would say that's jealousy because people were listening to them, not to the Jews. They freaked out. They got jealous. And then they ran around and got people stirred up and fired up against them, created all kinds of drama. And that's the kind of anti-Christian work we have to watch out for. Those are the types of warlike activities that the devil could be sending against us. And it could be from the people who are closest to us. Remember, the Jews were not too far from the apostles in terms of these texts, just like Trinitarians today, right? Or other groups. We use this, in many respects, the same text. We seem so close, and yet we're like miles away. I mean, they were forming a mob against them. It can get pretty heated, wouldn't you say? It talks about lying against the truth, not wisdom from above, earthly, animal, demonic. Right? See, the devil. When you have jealousy, bitter jealousy, and contentiousness like those Jews who were arguing against Paul had and Barnabas, it's demonic. Whether they're directly sent by the devil or they're reflecting his qualities of being against the seed of the woman, it's not very different. And not described very different right here, right? Demonic. And why is that? For where jealousy and contentiousness are, there disorder and every vile thing are. That's a lot of bad stuff, right? But the wisdom from above is first of all chaste, then peaceable, reasonable, ready to obey. Not just obey what anyone tells you, or anything anyone tells you, or even anything specific people you respect tell you. You obey the truth. And that's it. Full of mercy and good fruits, not making partial distinctions, not hypocritical. Golden rule. Do to others how you want them to do to you. You make a mistake, accept it, ask for forgiveness, do the same to others. If you can't do it, stop pretending you're not doing the work. That's the work. You cannot promote Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, the Savior, and you can't even forgive your brother for the sins that they commit, or others. Verse 18, moreover, the fruit of righteousness has its seed sown under peaceful conditions for those who are making peace. Making peace. You know, I had a request recently from someone who wanted to set up a debate for me. And of course, I've already done them, right? Multiple debates. And defended things multiple times and in many ways. Does that sound like making peace? Right? The Christian texts say the wisdom from above that's not bitter, jealousy and contentiousness, demonic, has its seed sown under peaceful conditions for those who are making peace, not making arguments and fights. You're just making fights. If you have to fight, right? If someone attacks you out, you're out in public and they come and they try to damage you out of nowhere for no reason. You have to fight. But you don't go out seeking someone to fight, right? Who does that except someone who wants to fight? That's not a Christian, though. Christians don't seek that. We'll do it if we have to, right? Look, verse 1 of chapter 4. The fruit of righteousness has its seed sown under peaceful conditions, right? For those making peace. From what source? He's building up to the same point I'm making. From what source are there wars? The dragon went off to wage war. I have the answer for James. He just might not have had the revelation yet. The source of the wars among us is the dragon. It's him. It's the wicked one. And if we don't recognize him before he starts wars among us, we're going to have a tough time. Because that's what he does. Right here it tells us, from what source are there wars? And from what source are there fights among you? Are they not from this source, namely from your cravings for sensual pleasure that carry on a conflict in your members? Who takes advantage of that? The devil. Didn't he do that with Eve and Adam? He's been doing it ever since. The real source is the devil, right? He's the one who brings out the worst in us. So if he's off waging war, right? That's what it says he's doing. That's what he's actively involved with, but within the constructs that God has made for him and for us, so that he's not allowed to do certain things and he is allowed to do other things. At certain times he can do certain things, and at other times he can't. That's why he has to go off and prepare for these times and these moments. And I'm going to share another text with you in a moment as we wrap it up that makes that more clear. But he goes on to say, you desire and yet you do not have. You go on murdering, coveting. It's kind of things he's talking about, and that the devil's causing to happen. And yet you do not obtain. You go on fighting and waging war. You do not have because of your not asking. You do ask. And yet you do not receive because you're not asking or you are asking for a wrong purpose, that you may expend it on your cravings for sensual pleasure. Now look at this. Adulteresses. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? I was talking to someone recently about text in Revelation and how they do or do not identify the 144,000 as real virgins. It says they're virgins, right? Didn't defile themselves with women. But then we shared various texts, like Paul to the Corinthians. We didn't get to this one, but it would fit as well, where the early Christians clearly speak of themselves as these spiritual virgins, not actual virgins, not all of them anyway, but as spiritually chaste and not being involved with the world, or in Revelation, the woman, right, like Jezebel, this adulterous, filthy, spiritually contaminating influence this permeating throughout the world, right, that pushes us against the Spirit of God in the Christ. And so he says, therefore, whoever wants to be a friend of the world constitutes himself an enemy of God. And let's just read a few more verses. Or does it seem to you that the Scripture says to no purpose, it is with a tendency to envy that the Spirit which has taken up residence within us keeps longing? However, the undeserved kindness which he gives is greater. So we have a problem. We know that. We have a work we have to do. We have to bear witness to Jesus and teach the truth. And then we have to deal with this spirit we have that can make us envious. It can make us desiring of different things. It can steer us away from the work. But it says, the undeserved kindness we received is greater. God opposes the haughty. He gives undeserved kindness to the humble ones. And then, now notice here, right? Subject yourselves to God, oppose the devil, and he will flee from you. So the devil's out there waging war, and we're doing this work that he's opposing. Right? We're the seed of the woman, bearing witness to God and to the Christ. He comes and tries to wage war with us. Here it says, we get to do what? Oppose the devil. Right? Stand up. We don't just have to take it all the time. But that doesn't mean we can beat the devil, right? Did Jesus defeat the devil continuously? I mean, he beat him. He did defeat him, right? But he opposed him in a way that didn't continue to engage him, is what I'm trying to say. He finished beating him, and that was it. And that's what this text says, right? Stand up, oppose the devil. If he's attacking you, he's waging war, is what I'm trying to emphasize to me and to you. That our work is the object of his attack. He cannot attack us to the extent that we're unable to fulfill Jah's will. So Jah controls all things through his Son in ways that we're allowed to be tested. We're allowed to make decisions and act, including oppose the devil. But if we don't do that, if we just engage the devil, right? We do have to engage in the sense of, quoting the text, right? Establishing the facts. That's what Jesus did. We can do that. We can teach the truth, text or otherwise, if it's something else that we're being tested in life. State the facts. Bear witness. What does a witness do? Testifies to the facts. What did you see? What did you do? What's your evidence? Do you have any evidence to support that? Yeah, I do. I have a lot. You want to talk about it? No. Oh, okay. Well, then I'll move on to someone else who does. Right now, you know I have it. And when you're ready, you can talk. You can bring it up, and I'll tell you about it. says, draw close to God, he'll draw close to you. Talks about a few other things. Give way to misery, mourn, let your laughter be turned to mourning, joy into dejection, because it's talking about humbling yourself. Because the devil will use what? He'll use pride if you don't keep it in check. And then verse 11, look at what it says. Quit speaking against one another, brothers. He who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks against law and judges law. Now, if you judge law, you are not a doer of law, but a judge. Last verse in this text. One there is that is lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. But you, who are you to be judging your neighbor? So, we have to be careful here, don't we, right? Quit speaking against brothers. When we get involved with these apologetic nuts and others, people who oppose us and what we're doing, right? Like the Jews in Acts 13 and elsewhere, opposed Paul and Barnabas. All they were doing was speaking about the one who came to fulfill these texts and whose principle would give people a better way of living without hypocrisy, without having to offer all these sacrifices according to law anymore, and have a potential basis for forgiveness of sins and life thereafter. Not hurting anybody. No traditions that create a problem for people. They're just testifying to their belief in this individual. So why would we spend time arguing with other people who claim to believe in this same individual, but just differently? Okay, fine. They believe differently. We need to teach the truth. We correct them. We point out the rock is on our side of the property. It's causing a hazard that needs to be moved. They keep arguing, okay, fine, we're going to establish the truth. We go to the city. We establish where the property line is. We establish what the law is. We have it enforced legally. Rock is moved. No more hazard on our lawn. Person who had to move the rock is still arguing and doesn't agree and doesn't believe they had to move the rock. Thinks we were wrong. We can go and argue all day long, or go and enjoy a rock-free lawn. No hazard. Sometimes we're just choosing to go argue about that rock that we've already had moved off our lawn. Let's go show through one last text why we don't have to do that. Matthew 13. Sometimes, we might feel that if we don't keep arguing, right, if we don't try to convince, for example, in the illustration I've been giving, our neighbor that they're wrong, right, evidenced by the fact they had to move the rock and the laws and the property line, all this, the evidence we can point to, just like with proving Jesus is the Christ. Sometimes we might think, well, if I don't help this person, they might, start going a little nuts and then become a hazard without the rock. So I got to help them. I have to help that person or they might lose, something. Or in a spiritual sense, like we may be able to convince ourselves that it's not good to argue with people, right? It's not part of the work we're doing. It actually makes it harder for us to do the work. And then more difficult to see what's going on around the rock, the snake in our illustration. And then we become susceptible, right? We become exposed because we're now doing something that's more risky. We're arguing around that rock that we already had moved. And we're not moving forward to take advantage of the victory, what we already proved. But then we might start thinking, like I was saying, we need to help that person. Right? Okay, we don't want to argue. That's true. But we don't want that person to die. And we think, well, if I don't go and try to help that person more, that could cost them their life. You're really not that important, and neither am I. We are, because we're being used in an important role that leads to that kind of potential, but it's God who makes that decision, and Jesus Christ. As a Christian, that's our belief. You're not going to be able to disrupt what they want done. You can be a part of it or not. You can't undo or keep them from getting the work done. It's a question of whether or not we're going to do the work. This is the work. We can't undo their work. We can only do it. So worrying about people too much, it's important to be concerned. We don't want people to be misled or think or teach lies, right? But didn't you see in those examples we reviewed and in Jesus Christ that you spend a little time, right? We go to you first, or like with the devil, I'll quote these texts to prove you're wrong. But once I've done that, you've got to move on. Go away. We're going to these people, the nations, texts say. And then look at all that happens after that. All right, so we've got to do some things. But look at this, Matthew 13. I'm hoping this will both help you understand better the work we've been talking about and bearing witness to Jesus as the Messiah, also with respect to God. But really, the primary work of a Christian is not in arguing about God. That's a part of it if it's something a person doesn't believe, or it can be if they believe something that's not true, like the Trinity. But there's a point, like with the Jews, and even with proving Jesus as the Christ, there's a point where that's no longer possible. This work or this accomplishment you're thinking you're going to do is not going to happen if you do it. So this is where undoing your own work can happen. Right? We can't undo the work of God or Christ, but we can undo our own opportunities. Like I was explaining, where if Paul and Barnabas had kept arguing with the Jews instead of turning to the people of the nations, not likely they would have rejoiced the way that we read that they did. Matthew 13. So, he talks about different illustrations, as we know. And one of the illustrations that he talks about, is seed. And how the different seed is thrown on different surfaces and begins to grow in different rates and at different qualities. And then he talks about another illustration involving the wheat and the weeds. Let's read this illustration and see if we can identify in it the work and how we should view other people who are involved, either as Christians or non-Christians. Matthew 13, verse 24. Another illustration he set before them, saying, the kingdom of the heavens has become like a man that sown fine seed in his field. While men were sleeping, his enemy came and oversowed weeds in among the wheat and left. All right. So there's a man with a field. We'll say man, could be one man with a field. That's what the text says. Sowed fine seed to produce crops of wheat. And at first, he was able to accomplish that, right? So that work is done. That's the work. Planting the seeds. In this case, as we're going to see, it could be specific to one individual or those like him, but as you know, we plant and we water, do we not? In terms of our Christian work, I plant, Apollos waters, God kept making it grow. That's what Paul talks about. All right. So that part, that planting and preparing the field part, probably watering, that's done in this illustration. After that happens, after the field is made ready and the seed is put down and it's starting to get ready to grow, while the people that put in all that work of plowing the field, putting in the seed, covering it up, making sure it's watered and ready to grow, after all that work, and you leave that work, that project, and you go home to rest, to come back the next day. During the nighttime, an enemy comes into your field and puts weeds right where you planted wheat, and then leaves before you find out what happened. Can you imagine that? You spend all this time preparing a field, which is hard work, and then planting the seeds and the watering, and someone has the nerve, right, the temerity to come in while you're sleeping. Really a criminal act, right? I mean, one of the worst things you could think of. Comes in. This is Jesus describing people. Certain people. One preparing this field, doing everything right. Another coming in at night and doing something against what the owner of the field did. Really weird. Like a terrible act, right? An enemy. When the blades sprouted and produced fruit, the weeds appeared also. So the slaves of the householder came up and said to him, Master, did you not sow fine seed in your field? How then does it come to have weeds? Verse 28, he said to them, an enemy, a man, did this. They said to him, do you want us to go out and collect them, the weeds? Verse 29, he said, no, that by chance while collecting the weeds, you uproot the wheat with them. Notice this. The slaves, when they found out about all the weeds, what did they do? Right? We're the slaves, are we not? And the master is Jesus, in terms of Christians. What do the slaves, the Christians, do once they realize there's weeds? Now imagine yourself, let's say you come across a Christian group, a group that claims to be Christian. And you find people in there that seem like they're nice and they're trying to do the best they can. I mean, they're not doing anything overtly wrong. They, may not, but they seem sincere. And then you notice there's a bunch of other people that don't seem sincere and that are taking advantage of them. What would you do as a Christian? See a whole congregation of people. Some seem sincere, like they're trying to do good, right? There's no evil intent that you can see or sense. And there's others who are clearly misleading these other people trying to do good. The ones trying to do good are just following the people who are intentionally deceiving them. And you can see that, right? They're taking advantage of them in different ways. Money, whatever it is, you can see it in this illustration. But just like the weeds, they can see it. I'm asking you to look at a group of people similar to what we're looking at here in this illustration as an equal, where the sower has a field of wheat sown, an enemy comes in and sows weeds. The slaves of the owner of the field notice the weeds in the field of wheat. And the very first thing they ask the master to do, if they should do, is what? Go out and collect them. Should we go over there and get all those weeds out of the field? Excuse me. Isn't that how you feel when you see a group of good wheat or wheat that you could eat, but not literally, that's good in that sense? And then there's a bunch of weeds interfering with that wheat. Don't you feel like going over and separating the wheat from the weeds? That's the work that those slaves were prepared to do. The master tells them not to do that. Not to do what you feel like you should do. That's what the master says. What we feel like we should do. Go over there, get those weeds out, get them out of there, let the wheat grow without those weeds. No. Don't do that. That's not the work. That's not the work. The work is not collecting the weeds. If anything, the work is collecting this. The enemy who sowed the weeds. But sometimes we can't do that. What can we do? Matthew 13:30. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the harvest season, I will tell the reapers, first collect the weeds and bind them in bundles to burn them up. Then go to gathering the wheat in my storehouse. Let them grow together. Our work is not defined in these texts as pulling up all the weeds. In fact, we're taught in these texts by the master, using an illustration because we're sometimes not able to get it right. We're told to let them grow together, because if we don't, we could actually do the opposite of what we're after. And that's how tricky this is. That's how important this is. That the thing we want to do, that reactive thing, weeds, let's clean them out. You know how I've often taught that we have to be careful when it comes to people who maybe we have a different Bible than them on a certain verse or two, and we want to talk to them about the right way the verse should be, and how we don't want to ruin their faith over a difference like that, or how maybe at times it's best to leave even people like Trinitarians with whom people like me disagree, because if they accept the Trinity as something that they can use to deal with things like polytheism in a way that allows them to keep worshiping the God of the Bible and accept the Messiah, Jesus, golden rule. Is it worth arguing with them about the Trinity? Pretending that that's our work? When in fact our obligation is to bear witness about the Christ and God, but where people won't listen, to move on and to let them grow together. Who would be the weeds in this illustration, according to, say, Acts 13? The Jews who were jealous and became bitter at the apostles, right? Well, they weren't killed right there. They were allowed to keep doing all that stuff. Forming mobs against them and stuff. Not good, right? It's not stuff we would want to promote, right? Paul and Barnabas didn't want them to do that. They were allowed to do that. The weeds are allowed to grow with the wheat. Our work, right? Just like in one of the earlier texts we read from Revelation, with the angel being our fellow worker with John as slaves to bear witness to the Christ. Our work is to make sure that the wheat does not get uprooted. That's the work. Right? How do we do that? By bearing witness to the Christ, by promoting belief in God. The exact same things we read about several times in Acts and elsewhere, they did. Right? Because when we establish the truth about the Christ and about God, the wheat grows strong. Doesn't matter if the weeds are around it. At the time of the harvest, then the wheat can be gathered without it being damaged, because people like you and me felt like we had to go and save everybody, go and change everybody, go and maybe not everybody, but or at least we thought we had to do more than we actually had to, when really we're told directly to let them grow together. Does this mean you never try to help people who are in a false religious group or doing things wrong, Greg? No, of course not. How many times did the apostles do it with the Jews? I'd say do it about that many times. You probably won't even need to do it that many times. But if you need a standard to go by, let's just stick with the text, okay? I'm happy with that. If we can just use these texts to establish how often we should be involved in trying to uproot the weeds by arguing on and on about things we don't have to argue about. We won. We've moved the rock. We have. It's done. We don't need to keep arguing about it. Just because the person who had to move the rock disagrees with us, so what? Did we or did we not prove the rock was on our yard and causing a hazard and we didn't have to have it in that position? We did. So why keep arguing about it? And in fact, if the reason is we want to hear the person admit it, well, that's both something we're not called to do and could uproot the wheat, trying to get that weed to agree with you. That's not likely to happen according to our experience, like we talked about previously anyway. So the chances of success are pretty low when it comes to trying to get the weeds out prematurely. But it's not easy, is it? That's tough when we see people, when we see weeds, people or beliefs that are difficult or not correct and that are a threat to the wheat. Our work is not to uproot the weeds. Our work is to keep the wheat standing with the weeds, so that at the time when God through Christ decides, the wheat will be gathered and the weeds will be gathered, and then they will be separated. And some people may say, well, yeah, we are supposed to overturn the deep things of Satan, though, aren't we, Greg, in terms of standing up, putting up a fight and fight for the faith? Yeah, I agree. I think the apostles and Jesus did that outstandingly. They quoted the text multiple times. They made a defense. They stood their ground. And then they let those weeds remain. They let those weeds, whether they were the devil or those who opposed the woman's seed, remain. Just like in that illustration. That doesn't mean we're not going to feel compelled to try to do a different kind of work. Put ourselves in a situation where we end up arguing over things we don't have to. Around objects like a hazardous rock where a snake could be more concealed and get around us when we don't have to. I want to see us concentrate on our work. Bearing witness to Jesus. Teaching the truth about God. And practicing the golden rule. I'm not interested in picking out all the weeds. Maybe we have to pick out a few weeds or try to deal with some weeds because they're just making too much of a problem. I can see. But I also see how those problems were dealt with efficiently by our best examples. And so I'm using this video to try to encourage you to follow those best examples. Focus on our work. The bearing witness to Jesus. What inspires prophesying, right? This is powerful stuff. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, there he is. We can teach this stuff. We have evidence. If we just can focus on the wheat. Try not to get distracted by the weeds. You're not supposed to be pulling them out anyway. Let them be. Let them grow with the wheat. Keep the wheat strong and growing so that at the time of the harvest, that wheat will be ready for the master. And nobody cares about the weeds, right? So when their time comes, they'll be dealt with by the master. The only thing the master is going to want to know from us is, did you do the work I assigned you? Or did you do something that I didn't ask you to do? That actually caused more damage. I guarantee you, the latter is going to be a lot harder to explain and a lot more difficult to deal with than just doing the things we're told to do. Keeping things simple and working closely with our brothers and sisters to the extent that we're able to bear witness to Jesus and to teach the truth about God as we practice the golden rule.